Greetings and welcome to what I think is an exciting topic, British political parties and elections. And if you just take a superficial glance at Great Britain and the United States, it appears that they have a few things in common, that both have two dominant political parties in Britain, the Conservative Party and Labor; in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans. Both the United States and Britain use single member plurality districts. In other words, one representative represents a group of people. For example, in the United States, a House member represents a little over 700,000 people. In Britain, a representative represents about one-tenth that, about 70,000, and yet one person represents a geographical constituency in both countries. The rules of the game, the single member plurality system, both encourage two party dominance. Both Britain and the United States have stressed order and stability over democracy. And yet, if you take a closer look, there are some substantial differences. And so in this section, I'm going to try to point out some of the significant differences between American and British elections and parties, but I'm also going to talk about common features. And so certainly I would say if you take a look at British politics in elections, I think it's a much simpler system. I think it's a much easier system. I think as a voter, your role is clearer. I think the British model is more responsive than the American system. So it sounds like I'm a fan of the British system, and I suppose that I am. But there are some pitfalls, and I will try to balance this conversation out by talking about both. So if you look at the top of your notes where it says elections overview, I wrote in Great Britain, elections are short. Usually a national election is a month or less. The last election was some 25 days. Certainly much shorter than in the United States. In Great Britain, all of the elected officials, the Prime Minister, Cabinet Secretaries, all the members of the House of Commons have the same term of office. They all are there for 5 years or less, and I'll talk about that later if a prime minister calls for elections early. In the United States, every political office is different. The political offices have different terms of office. House members, for example, are seemingly always running for reelection because members of the House of Representatives only have a 2 year term. Presidents have a 4 year term. U.S. senators have a 6 year term. The American representatives also represent different constituencies. They represent different groups of people. So while it is true that the president represents the whole nation, a senator only represents a state, and a House member represents a district, which in most cases is only a part of a state. And if the state is a large urban state like California, a representative may only represent part of a town, part of a city. Multiple congresspersons, for example, represent various parts of Los Angeles. Of course, if we're dealing with a sparsely populated state like Montana, for example, or no, I think Montana has two actually. Wyoming is the classic example. It is the least populated state, and a representative represents the whole state. Now, in the United States, we have what's called fixed calendar elections. We know when our next election is going to be in 2022. We know our next presidential election is going to be in 2024. And again, because different people have different terms of office, for example, in the U.S. Senate, only a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. But in Great Britain, if there's a national election, for example, there has to be one every 5 years, then all 650 members are up for re-election, just like the U.S. House of Representatives. That is a common feature. When there is an election in America, all 435 members are up for re-election every 2 years. So in Britain, when there is a national election, all of them, all 650, are up for re-election. I did point out a couple of factual details. The last election that your textbook talks about is the election of 2010. So I'm going to update you in this section and list what happened in 2015 and 17 and in 2019. And if you take a look at those last two elections, 2017 and 2019, elections were called very early, unusually early, certainly unlike what we had seen the previous few decades. So in Britain, all registered voters are, right, over 18 are eligible to vote. That looks like the United States. We passed a constitutional amendment allowing 18-year-olds the right to vote when I was a teenager. The difference is in Britain, local officials are required to register all voters, so there's near universal registration of the electorate. One of the things that is a hell of a debate in the United States is to what degree, how easy should it be to register? The Democrats seemingly want to make it almost too easy to register to vote. The Republicans seemingly want to make it too difficult to vote. And so both of them accuse each other of playing politics. And of course, both are, right? In the United States, the higher the voter turnout, the better it is for Democrats in most cases. The lower the voter turnout, the better it is for Republicans. Both of them are trying to engage in behavior that will enhance their chances of winning. So they're serving their own self-interest. Now, in that first paragraph, there is something that I want you just to think about. I'm not going to test you on this, but if we look at the last general election in Britain in 2019, the total election was 25 days long from start to finish. The last presidential election, which seemingly just concluded recently because of all of the hullabaloo about whether it was rigged, whether it was fair, or whatever, it lasted 650 days. I mean, from the time that Ted Cruz, and he was the first person to announce he was running for president, until until the race was over, until the election was over, 650 days. It seems bizarre. They're already talking about who the lead candidates might be on the Republican side. Not just Mr. Trump, but if Mr. Trump decides to bail out, what Republicans are seemingly in the mix to run. So it almost seems in American presidential politics that there's a perpetual election. And of course, in Britain, the criticism is there's a perpetual election, right? The argument is in Britain, even though the election's only 25 days, in Britain there is always not only the government, but what we call the shadow government. And the shadow government is simply the party out of power, and they are organized so that if there is an election, they can hit the ground running. So both the actual government and the so-called shadow government are ready to govern at any given time. And so there isn't a lengthy period of transition, right? In American presidential politics, for example, we have a presidential election in November, and we don't have an inauguration day for 2.5 months, for approximately 10 weeks. So 10 weeks allows the new president to get their affairs in order, to consider who they're going to put in their cabinet, etc. In Britain, there's an election, and immediately after the results are known, the other party is ready to govern, or if a candidate wins re-election, obviously they're ready to go. I want to skip down from the overview to the 7 significant differences between American and British elections, and the one that just absolutely leaps off the map. I put it first because I really do think it is the most significant difference, number one, between American and British elections, and that's money. And you can see I have it broken out between the United States and Great Britain. I believe, frankly, in the United States, too much money is spent on elections. And interestingly, I believe that not enough money is spent in Great Britain. So what a contrast. So uh, I'll read my notes and make some comments as I go along here in the 4.5 minutes that I have left in this mini lecture. But in the 2016, so that was the last one. I don't have the figures from 2020 yet. But in the 2016 American election cycle, 6.5 billion and more was spent this time. I just don't have the figure. But $6.5 billion was spent on the presidential election, the Senate races, the House races. In reality, my number is wrong there when I have in the notes that money is spent on 536 elections. It's actually less than that because it's 435 House races, about 34 Senate races, and then one presidential race. So it's actually less than 500 elections. So what's written in your notes is wrong. Take a look at the next sentence because this is absolutely frightening to me. In just the two 2020 Georgia Senate races, those special elections that were held in January, over $850 million was spent in just those two Senate races on behalf of 4 candidates. Now, admittedly, these were the 2 costliest Senate races in American history, but it demonstrates just how essential money is in American election races. I looked up a statistic, and over the last 20 years in American House races, the candidate that has spent the most money has won over 90% of the time. I think it was 92%, but I could be wrong on that. But it was over 90% of the time. The money, obviously, in American elections is overwhelmingly spent on television, it's spent on radio, increasingly on online platforms and communication, but it is still heavily driven by television. The philosophy in the United States is that in this particular case, the country is placing a priority on freedom of expression through political donations. Even the Supreme Court of the United States has declared that money is speech. To me, that's a ridiculous position. I don't think that money is speech. I certainly think that money can buy speech, but I don't think that money is speech. Now, contrast that with Great Britain. The country places an emphasis on equity, on equality, and there is a belief that there should not be excessive spending because that would give a particular party or a particular candidate an unfair advantage over their opponent. So I gave you a number, and just contrast this with the American number. In 2017, there were 75 political parties that ran candidates. There were over 3,400 candidates running for office, and the total spent by all of them in 650 races was about $50 million, 41 million pounds. Think about this. In Great Britain, the average major party candidate spends about 15,000 pounds in an election. So in Britain, candidates and parties spend far less than they're allowed by law. And the reason is that the parties are allowed free media time to unveil their platforms, which they do. So in Britain, to conclude this section, in Britain, money is not a significant factor in elections. However, in the United States, it is the most important factor. In the next mini lecture, I'll get into the media, campaigning, bargaining, etc. So, hope you enjoyed it. I'll be talking to you soon.